Hi, and welcome to The Lowest Crime, the podcast where we dive into criminal cases from one of the lowest countries in the world, the Netherlands. I'm Eline, and today's story is one of the most disturbing cases in Dutch history. Serial killers are rare in the Netherlands, but Michel Stokx is a dark and terrifying exception. This is the story of a man who lived a double life, an ordinary truck driver, a partner and father, and yet, underneath the surface, a predator of children, a serial killer. Today we explore the story of Michel Stokx and his victims. Was he born a monster, or did the cruelty, betrayal and the neglect he suffered turn him into one? We look at warning signs ignored, systems that failed, and the lives cut tragically short. Please be aware that today's episode contains details of violence, assault and murder, which some listeners will find disturbing. Also, although I always try my very best to bring you all the known facts, I am just an amateur podcast creator, so there is always a chance of me making a mistake. Without further ado, let's get into the story of Michel Stokx. Michel Stokx was born on January 17, 1942, in Belgium, in a quiet small town near Ghent. At first, his arrival brought joy. His mother called him a wolk van een baby, a cloud of a baby, but happiness in the Stokx household was short-lived. Michel's father was physically present but emotionally absent. He worked long days and drank away his nights. His mother, overwhelmed by poverty and the struggles of raising 4 children, grew cold and distant. Affection was rare and punishment common. From an early age, Michel wandered the streets alone. At school, he struggled to fit in, and at home, he felt invisible. He cycled 7 kilometers to school each day, rain or shine, as many of us do in the Netherlands or Belgium. But if, because of that, he returned home late for dinner, his mother would send him back outside without food, saying, "You must not be hungry then." On top of that came another life-defying trauma. At the age of 12, a neighbor caught him and some boys comparing their genitals. A simple moment of childhood curiosity. However, when his mother found out, her reaction was brutal. She beat him with a stove poker until his scalp split open. That night, Michel ran away. He slept in a junkyard, cold and afraid. When found, child services intervened, but the damage was already done. Child Protective Services placed Michel in Catholic institutions, places meant to protect him. But behind the walls of the paters in Ghent, instead of being protected from his unsafe home, he was sexually abused by the priests there. When he tried to confess what happened, they told him to pray harder. There was no comfort, no protection, only shame. Psychologists later said that these experiences shaped his entire understanding of sex, power, and love. Abuse and control became intertwined in his mind. By the age of 15, Michel was acting out his pain. He would molest younger children, seeking power where he once felt powerless. He was arrested over and over. 8 convictions in Belgium for sexual offenses against minors, but nothing worked. Fines, probation and prison, it all failed. In 1976, the Belgian authorities gave up. They expelled him to the Netherlands, his country of citizenship, where they thought that he would no longer be their problem. In Franeker, the Netherlands, Michel tried to rebuild his life. He started working as a truck driver, married a woman named Pidi and had a daughter, Natasha. But beneath the surface, his urges never stopped. He offended again in 1980 and was sent to prison, then sentenced to TBS, forced psychiatric treatment, at the Van Mestdag Clinic in Groningen. There, he played the part of the perfect patient. He smiled at the doctors, said the right things and convinced them that he was ready for release. In 1986, they granted him supervised leave, and then unsupervised. During this time, 11-year-old Cheryl Morien vanished without a trace. Though suspicion fell on Stokx, no evidence connected him to her disappearance. On June 22, 1989, Michel Stokx was back behind the wheel of his truck. This time, he was hauling a load of cherries through Germany. It was on the outskirts of Paderborn that he crossed paths with 13-year-old Marco Visor. Marco was a boy like many others, inquisitive, friendly, and fascinated by the towering trucks and machinery on the open road. When he approached Stokx to ask about the truck, the conversation seemed harmless, even kind. Stokx asked the boy if he wanted to ride along with him in his truck, and Marco agreed. The two traveled nearly 400 kilometers together. According to Stokx, he initially had no intention of harming the boy. Marco appeared to be enjoying his experience, and Stokx assumed that he may have run away from home. After all, why would a child willingly spend the entire day with a stranger? He later said that he enjoyed the company. It felt to him as though he had gained a companion. When they arrived at the factory where Stokx was supposed to unload his shipment of cherries, it turned out that they closed for the weekend. With 2 days to wait, he drove Marco to a rest area frequented by truckers, spending the night. No one seemed to question the presence of a child with him. To others, Marco might have looked like a nephew or even his son. Later that evening, after they had eaten, the two settled in for the night in the cab of the truck. It was then, in the confined space of the truck, that he sexually assaulted the boy. The next morning, when Stokx wanted to repeat his actions, Marco refused, and something in Stokx's mind snapped. He was terrified the boy would tell someone, and so he strangled him to death. He drove for hours with Marco's lifeless body beside him before dumping him along a forested roadside outside Paderborn. Then he climbed back into his truck and kept driving. A little over a year later, on August 15, 1990, history repeated itself. 9-year-old Salim Tatil, a bright, youthful child, was playing outside near Neustadt when he crossed paths with Michel Stokx. A week earlier, Michel Stokx had damaged his truck by driving under a bridge that was too low for clearance. Wanting to verify some details about the incident, he returned to the scene. While there, 9-year-old Salim approached him to admire his new Mercedes. At that moment, Stokx later admitted he decided he wanted to take the boy. He turned on the charm and persuaded Salim to get into the car. Without hesitation, Stokx drove directly to Luxembourg. He claimed that Salim initially panicked, but said that he managed to calm him down. After the detour, Stokx drove the boy all the way back to his home in Asse. Once there, he took a shower while Salim sat in the living room, quietly reading a book. When he was done, he suggested Salim take a shower as well, which he did. While in the shower, Stokx sexually assaulted him. After the fact, Michel claimed he intended to let Salim go. He even said he planned to drop him off in Amsterdam. But then, driving on the highway near Lelystad, a police car passed him and panic took over. Afraid Salim would cry for help, afraid he'd be stopped, afraid of losing his fragile freedom, Michel pulled over and strangled poor Salim. He left his body in a wooded area and continued his route as though nothing had happened. Michel's final victim, 11-year-old Jessica Laven, crossed paths with Stokx on a sunny day at a public swimming pool on July 27, 1991, in Zwaag, the Netherlands. She had lost the key to her bicycle lock and she was looking for help. Michel offered to assist. He gained her trust and lured her into his apartment. There, as before, the horrific pattern repeated itself. Abuse, then murder. Jessica's body was found along the A7 motorway, discarded by the side of the road. The Netherlands was in shock. By now, the public was terrified. Police across Germany and the Netherlands collaborated on what would become one of the largest child murder investigations in Dutch history. Witnesses described a man in a truck. Composite sketches circulated nationwide and tips flooded in. But the breakthrough came from Michel's own profession. Trucking logs, tachograph readings, and route records placed him near the locations and times of each disappearance. On October 20th, 1991, Michel Stokx was arrested. At first, he denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Fibers from Jessica's swimsuit matched the upholstery of his truck. Salim's DNA was found on his clothing, and Marco's disappearance aligned perfectly with his route. On November 26, 1991, Stokx finally confessed, coldly, almost clinically. He admitted to abducting, abusing, and murdering all 3 children. But still, he insisted that he never intended to kill. According to him, the murders were impulsive acts driven by panic, not premeditation. The courtroom was packed when Michel stood trial in 1992. Journalists, grieving families, and curious citizens filled the gallery. The crimes had horrified the nation. Now, the question remained, would justice be served? The prosecution painted Stokx as a dangerous individual beyond rehabilitation. They described his murders as cold, opportunistic, and entirely preventable if the system had worked properly. Painstaking descriptions of each victim's final moments silenced the courtroom, and the air was heavy with disbelief and sorrow. The defense, on the other hand, tried to explain Stokx's actions through the lens of his horrific childhood. They argued that he was the product of violence and abuse, a man warped by trauma and failed by every institution meant to help him. Psychiatrists testified that Stokx suffered from compulsive pedophilia and an inability to cope with rejection or emotional stress. But they also warned, his condition was incurable. Without lifelong supervision, he would always remain a threat. The court ruled decisively. Michel Stokx was sentenced to 20 years in prison and TBS, an indefinite psychiatric detention. He would never be released unless doctors could provide absolute certainty that he would no longer pose any danger. But that certainty would never come. In prison, Michel Stokx lived a quiet, isolated existence. Individuals convicted of crimes against children are typically at the very bottom of the prison hierarchy. So, he spent most of his days alone, painting children's playgrounds, which, given the history of his crimes, leaves a definite feeling of unease. On September 25, 2001, his life came to a sudden and mysterious end. According to the official report, Stokx was working in a prison workshop. He spilled turpentine on himself and accidentally broke a light bulb, causing a spark. In seconds, he was engulfed in flames and died shortly after from his injuries. But not everyone believed it was an accident. Some suspected suicide. There's whispering of revenge, of inmates or guards who wanted to punish him further for his crimes. But whatever the true story may be, on September 25, 2001, Michel Stokx died in prison. But the story of Michel Stokx doesn't end there. Although the 3 murders he was convicted of have been solved, he still leaves behind questions. Because the story doesn't end with the victims we know about. There is another name forever tied to his legacy, Nathalie Gijsbrechts. On February 26, 1991, 10-year-old Nathalie disappeared while waiting for her school bus in Leefdaal, Belgium. She vanished without a trace in broad daylight. Michel Stokx quickly became the prime suspect. He was, after all, active in the area around that time. Belgian investigators brought Stokx to Leuven, where they interrogated him for months. Stokx denied knowing anything about Nathalie, but the evidence against him was strong. He had tampered with his truck's tachograph to fabricate an alibi, claiming he was in France when the girl vanished. But investigators discovered that his fuel card had been used much closer to the Belgian border. Like with his other crimes, the timelines, locations, and his behavior all fit. Yet, without a body or a confession, Belgian authorities could not close the case. Then in 2001, Stokx died in prison, taking his secrets with him. Belgian Commissioner Gilbert Houben, who led the investigation, remembered the moment he received the call that Stokx had died. He had turned pale, and I will never find her. To this day, Nathalie Gijsbrechts still remains missing. Many, including her mother, are convinced Michel Stokx was her killer. But the official records remain incomplete. Another life lost in the shadows of his crimes. This case truly raises the question if monsters are born or made. Michel Stokx had a terrible childhood, but then again, so do many others, and they never turn to what he has done. What do you guys think? Is his childhood to blame, or is it something that was inside him all along? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, that concludes today's story. If you appreciated this episode, please leave a like and consider subscribing. You can find any images related to the case on the Lowest Crime Instagram account. Thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.